Hello and welcome to the next part of my Unity tutorial for creating a 3D platforming adventure game, extravaganza, 3D, third person, etc, etc. So far we have from last time in our tutorial system a little character that now runs around whenever we move around, and we've got our third person controls as well for jumping. Now we're going to add a couple of different things, including a jump animation and a transition. Once we understand how to animate between the different animation states for a jump, we can apply the same logic to animate a bunch of different things, but let's do the jump first. And then but before we do that, there are a few sort of things I want to show you guys. The first thing I want to show you guys is this magnitude sort of gate for rotation. I found a better solution too. So instead of moving around and then having a sort of drop off of where your character will rotate depending on how much we're moving, a smoother way of doing that is actually if I'm going to delete this if statement here, and what I've done is I've added a multiplication to our rotation speed, which is equal to the magnitude of the movement input divided by 5. And this is basically just taking the value of how much you're moving, but instead of testing whether it's a high or a low value, we're using that value itself to multiply with our rotation speed. So basically, the more we move, the faster the rotation is. And so it's this nice smooth curve of rotation instead of snapping. So this is something you could do to improve your rotation smooth, which is basically it was this or something like it before with this if statement to do with the magnitude. I'm going to get rid of that if statement and the two curly brackets and instead just have this one line of code where we are using the movement input that we had before and we're using it as the magnitude for our rotation speed. The other thing that I've gone and done is added a couple of different fun jumping mechanics, namely a double jump and a hover, which we can hopefully animate at some point as well. So at the moment, whenever you jump, you can't jump. Normally you can't jump again until you land on the ground, but I've now changed that a little bit with this double jump that I have here. So I've made a public bool, and let me zoom in here a little bit. So I've made a new public bool, which is for our double jump, whether we have double jumped or not. So the first time that we jump, if jump input is true, then we turn jump input to false, etc. Now we will jump in the air as normal, but I've got this extra check here, which is that if we're not grounded, then we'll use up our double jump. So double jump will be true. And then additionally, we not only have to be is grounded as one option for being a legitimate jump, but even if we're in the air and we haven't double jumped, we can still jump. So basically, the first time we jump, we need to be is grounded because double jump will not be false. But the second time, okay, double jump still isn't false, so we can actually jump even though we're not on the ground. But then the third time we try and jump, well, we're both not on the ground and we've already used up our double jump, so we can only jump twice, once off the ground and once in the air. So I've added this code here to this if statement. I've added this particular check here. And then finally, we're just going to have to reset double jumped whenever we land on the ground. And if we land on the ground, let's see, on our grind check script. So in our grind check script, when we land on the ground, not only are we setting is grounded to true, but we're also setting double jump to false, as well as is grounded. So that's the double jump. And so I'll demonstrate this. I can jump in the air and then I can jump again. But if I go ahead and spam A, I can only do my double jump. So I can only jump twice. And you can also see the variables changing. So I've got double jumped tick box. And you can see the first time I jump, double jump isn't true. But then the second time, you can see the tick mark for a double jump is true until I land on the ground again. And then it gets set back to false. So that's something that you could try and implement if you want to double jump in your game. The other thing, and we haven't got the animation yet for this double jump, but we will in the future. The other thing I did was a hover. So in some games like Spyro the Dragon, whenever you are holding down jump in midair, you sort of float down to the ground, or like in Arkham Asylum, I know you do this as well as Batman, you float down with your wings spread. And it doesn't look so great, this one in particular, without the animation to go with it. But again, what I have to implement this hover is basically that whenever we jump, we set hovering to true. And then I've got this new check here, which is that if we are hovering and we're holding down space or the joystick button, which is to say we're still holding down the button that we used to jump, then we'll only set hovering to false when that isn't true. So you can see here, I've got get key up instead of get key down. So that means that whenever I release the key, either the space key or the joystick button, and I'm hovering, I'll stop hovering. So that's good for our input. Do note that I've got an extra curly bracket here because I've got a curly bracket that starts for our if statement. Then I have a curly bracket that starts within these two conditions of the if statement, the get key up and this other get key up. So then by the end of it, all the way over here, I actually have 3 brackets to close out first this particular section of the if statement, and then the if statement itself. And also notice that these say get key up and not get key down because I'm checking to see have we released the buttons that we were using to hover. Additionally, just as we did with the double jump, we're setting hovering to false again when we land on the ground here. And finally, what do we actually do when we're hovering? Well, I've added this if statement here. For if we're hovering, we're going to add a force to the body. So this is just like jumping. But in this case, because we're adding the force, an upward force to counteract our downward force of gravity, we're going to multiply it by time.delta time, as well as this vector 3, which is just up in the y-axis, 0, 1, 0, which is going straight up. We're multiplying it by time.delta time. We're multiplying it by the hover force, which is just a Boolean value that I've created here as well. So I've created this float. So then we multiply this by time.delta time, and we also use this velocity change. And then all that we have left to do is set the value of our hover force to something reasonable to counteract gravity. We want this value to be high enough that it's counteracting gravity, but not too high, because if it's higher than gravity, then we'll actually rise up into the air as we hover. So at the moment I have it set to 15, and that seems to work well. Here's me jumping normally and falling back on the ground, and then here's me jumping and holding down the A button. Again, doesn't look great without some sort of gliding animation, but it basically slows your fall if you're holding down A. That might be something you want, maybe it isn't. Something to experiment with and try implementing perhaps. Now, before I move on to the animations, there's one more thing that I did change as well. I did change the mass of my character. It was at 60, and I noticed that whenever my mass of my character was at 60 and I jumped on this physics object, this was a cube that I had. So I'm going to click on this cube. This is a cube that I had a rigid body on, because the idea is that I want my player to move around and bump into it, and maybe that could be part of a puzzle. So I added a rigid body to my cube, and then if my character had the default that I had on before 60, I could push around the cube, which was great fun. But then whenever I jumped on the cube, there was this sort of jittery effect, you see, where I can hardly stay on top of the cube as it jitters and jitters about. And that's because my mass is higher than that of the cube's. The mass of the cube is 1 and my mass is 60, which is quite a lot higher, which means that it's kind of, I'm pressing down into the cube and the cube wants to ping off into space. So to counteract that, I'm going to change the mass of my character to 10, which is just a little bit higher, which is just not quite as large a gap. And now whenever I jump on my cube, it's a little more stable, so I could have a puzzle where I have to push this cube around, like to get back up onto this platform, and then I can jump onto this platform and then up onto this static cube. So that's just a couple of different features that I have going on, but now let's move on to animating our character with a jump animation. And a jump animation is sort of strange in that what we really need from the jump animation is 3 different animations. We need the start of the jump to trigger when we start jumping. We want some sort of animation to loop while the character's falling through the air or going up in the air or both. And then we want an animation to play when our character lands. But usually that means we take an animation and we split it up into 3 parts. Here I have Mixamo open, which is where I'm getting my animations from, at least for now, as placeholders. We could replace these animations later, but it's good to have something. So I'm going to go ahead and type in jump and see if I can find a good jump animation that I can use. So here's a running jump, which can be good, and a jumping up here. What we're really looking for, probably for the best option, is something where our character is jumping up into the air and then landing. This animation here that is simply called jump, I'm going to use because I've got a character that's sort of standing still, so it will work if we're jumping just from standing still, but I can also blend this animation with our running animation so that whenever I'm jumping as I'm running. This one looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and download this. I'm going to download it just as an FBX. I'm going to say without skin, just to make the download slightly faster, and I'm going to go ahead, why not, FBX for Unity, though FBX will work as well, I'm pretty sure. So I'm going to go ahead and download this animation, and it should hopefully just show up as a download here as an FBX. So I'm going to drag that FBX, whoops, I'm going to drag that in. It's kind of hard to show on my screen. I'm going to drag it in. Does this work? No, because it won't flick, sorry, between them. So I have to move this off my screen. But I'm dragging it in from that section, just as I have done with the other animations. So now that we've got our jump animation, we can open it up, and we need to do the same things to it that we did with our idle. So that means we're going to go ahead and go to the rig on the animation that we just imported, this jump. I'm going to change it from generic to humanoid, apply, and it will come up with the question. Oh no, it didn't this time. Okay, so we're applying it, and now we can see this animation, and we can play this animation with the default Unity avatar. So this is looking good. However, our animation is at the moment a single jump animation, and you can see from this import that we have this clip, and then we have this timeline of the clip. And by default, we just have one clip for the animation, and that is the entirety of that animation. But really what we want to do is actually split it into 3 parts. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this little plus button next to the jump. I'm going to have jump. I'm going to press this twice so that I have 3 animations. I'm going to call this one, how do I rename this? Let's see. It doesn't, oh yes, of course, it's down here. So I'm going to select this first clip, and I'm going to call it jump start. I'm going to go ahead and click on the second one, and we'll call this jump loop, maybe. Jump fall, I could call it. I'll call it jump loop. And then this one I'll call jump end. So the timeline here of this animation is relative to the entire animation. So for the jump start, I'm going to try and calculate by moving my cursor along roughly where I've ended the start of the jump. So I can see I lift off like this, jumps into the air. So I'm going to go ahead and say that the jump start ends about here. So I'm going to go ahead, and I can see where this is on the timeline. I'm going to drag the blue cursor, the sort of blue dongle that's showing the end of the animation. I'm going to drag this in to about the 1 minute mark here. So now the jump start animation is going to jump, and it's not going to continue on. So then our jump loop is presumably going to be from that starting point. So I'm going to drag this left one to the 1. And then in terms of what we loop, I'm actually just going to do a simple thing here. And let's see, I could have an animation that loops like this, where our character's legs cycle in the air, or I do loop time like this. Or I could just go ahead and make it a 1-frame animation by dragging both of these blue dongles right to the same position. And that's easier to do with an animation that hasn't been designed to loop over and over again. So we'll just have the character freeze in place as they're jumping, and we can tweak this later. Finally, with the jump end, it's going to be similar, only it's going to be the opposite. So we're going to drag this front part to here, so then this is the animation that our character plays when they land. So now we've got these 3 different animations, start, loop, and end, and I'm going to go and apply those. Now let's go to our animator. To access the animator, I can go different ways, but I'm going to go ahead and click on my player. I can see the animator is attached to the player, so I'm going to go back down in here. Here's the character that's being actually animated, and here is the animation controller. So I'm going to double click, and I could also just select this asset as well if I wanted to do it that way. So I'm going to go back to my base layer, because this is just looking at the blend tree of running from idle to running, of going from blending from idle to running. We're going to create a new transition, so I'm going to go create state, right click, create state empty, and this one will be called Jump Start. So I'm going to click on it and change the name to Jump Start. Then I'm going to right click on my blend tree, which is the default state for a character to be in as they're running around, and I'm going to make transition to Jump Start. I'm going to click on Jump Start and select motion. Our motion will be to jump, so I'm going to click Jump Start. So we want to play the animation of jumps of the start of the jump whenever we transition. And then finally, I'm going to want to say that it doesn't have an exit time, which means it won't automatically just transition between the blend tree to the start of the jump animation. And sorry, to access those values, I clicked on the transition arrow between these two nodes. So I've unticked has exit time, and now instead it's going to complain at me. I'm going to have to add a condition. So I'm going to go ahead and press plus. Now I don't want the condition to be blend, so I'm going to have to create a new parameter. So over here where it says there's layers and parameters, I'm going to click on parameter, and the parameters are a bit like variables. In this case, we're going to make a bool, and the bool is going to be called jumping. So if jumping is true, we want to transition, which means I'm going to go ahead and change the condition of this transition from blend to jumping. And I'm going to make sure that I've set this to true, because it's only if jumping is true that we will transition from one state to the other. Now, our character isn't going to actually ever transition at the moment because we never changed this value jumping. But if I change this value jumping here, you can see my character starts to jump and then gets frozen in place whilst they're jumping. So this is looking good. Now we have to go back to our code and work out how we can set the value of our bool. Well, here we have the code from last week's tutorial of our animation controller.setFloat blend to our running speed. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the same kind of code, but we're going to set a bool to true, which is going to be our jumping. So let's find the code for when we jump. Here it is here. Here's the velocity that we're creating to jump with our character. So we can just go ahead and add a new line of code here, copy paste in this animation controller. Now this time, whenever we jump, we're not setting a float, we're going to set a bool. So I've changed that from set float to set bool. The name of the bool we're changing within these quotation marks is going to be jumping. And then the value is just going to be straight up true because we are now jumping. So I'm going to go ahead and build that script. So now with everything set up, whenever I run the game, hopefully the character will automatically start the jump animation whenever I press A or spacebar to jump into the air. So they did, but the animation was very slow. It took them far too long to actually transition from one state to the next. So there's different ways of solving this particular issue. But you can see that because my jump and I just like instantly ping off the ground, but jumping animation is really slow. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is a couple of different things. The first thing I'm going to do is change this transition time. At the moment, it's very, very long so that we have a nice blend. I'm going to go ahead and take that transition time and bring it all the way down. So I've opened up settings and I've looked at my transition duration. I'm going to change this to like 0.05 seconds of transition. So it's very, very fast blend from idle to jump. So that's better, but our jump animation is still very slow. So I'm going to click on my jump start and I'm going to go to my speed and I'm going to set this speed to a much faster animation. So I'm going to set the speed to 5. So now my character will jump really fast. Now that's a bit too fast, so I'll put it down to 2.5 maybe. And this is just a multiplier of how fast it's going. So 2 will be it goes twice as fast. There's still sort of like this little delay, isn't there, where I press A to jump and then my character bends down to jump and then jumps up off the ground. So I'm going to go back to my animation import that I have here of the jump. I'm going to click on my animation jump start and I can see my character spends quite a lot of time bending down before jumping up off the ground as part of this animation. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is drag the start of the animation till the character is just about to jump around this mark here. So then the blend will handle the transition to that point. So there's still a bit of a delay and the animation is now quite fast. Oh, sorry, I hadn't actually applied it there. So now that I've applied that change that I made, it looks a lot better. It looks a lot faster. I think the actual animation speed is still too fast, so I'm going to change that back to, like, say, 1.5. That looks a lot better, doesn't it? Let's see. I think it does. So I'm walking around and then I press A to jump and then our character just springs off the ground. We probably don't want to add like a delay to our actual jump. We probably just want to change the animation so it fits the snappiness of the jump we already have, because we're trying to create this sort of arcadey Super Mario style jumping, right? So I think I'm happy with this jump because our character just springs up off the ground. So what do? We made this a lot of a shorter start. So our character is already sort of crouched down at the start of this animation, and we changed this transition time. Now it's time to loop the character's animation. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new empty, which is going to be called jump loop. So I'm going to call this jumping loop. I'm going to create a transition from this point to this jump loop. I'm going to go ahead and say that it does have an exit time of 0. So I'm going to open up this and say it has 0. So it's just kind of transition straight from that to the other. And then I'm going to say it has an exit time of 1, which means that after I've started jumping, it will transition to jumping loop. So what did I do there? I kept it as having an exit time, and I changed transition duration to 0 and exit time to 1. So basically it will just immediately transition from jump start to jumping loop whenever the jump start animation is complete. And the motion we'll use this time is going to be the jump loop. And that's just so that we can loop over and over again this jumping before we check to see if we're back on the ground again. You can see something strange is going on here, where whenever we do transition from the jump start to the jump loop, our character sort of like resets in this strange position here. So I wonder what's gone wrong with our jump loop animation. Maybe it's something to do with the fact that it's 0 frames, because I have it from start 30 to start end 30. So I'm going to change this in my animation of the jump loop from start 30 to start 31, so that it does in fact include one single frame of animation. Now let's see what happens. Yes, that works a lot better. The other thing I can do is I could just change my speed to 0 as well, and that way we don't have this weird flickering animation. I changed the speed there of the jump loop to 0 so that whenever we jump we're frozen. Though our character does sort of ping up into the sky, and I think that's because our jump loop is happening from at a different position. Something to do with the Y position. Let's see. Does this automatically set up something for me that I don't want because of the loop match? Let's see, body orientation. I'm not sure. So because it's not really working the way I want to, what I'm actually going to go ahead and do is, let's see, what do I want to do here? I'm going to keep going and see if I can fix this later. So at the moment our character sort of pops up into the sky, don't they? Because there's something going on with this Y position. So maybe I can go ahead and bake this into the pose, the root transform Y position, by ticking this. I'm going to apply that, and then I'm going to do the same thing to the jump loop. Apply this, and see, hopefully that will keep the same Y position as I jump in the air. There we go, that solved the issue. So basically, because it was resetting as a new animation, it was resetting the Y position, but I wanted to keep that relative distance the same between the jumping start and the loop and then the end as well. So what I'm going to do is suggest you do is, when you click on this jump start, set this root transform position Y to be true and apply, and then do the same thing for the loop and the same thing for the jump end. So I'm going to do that now, and that will bake the Y position there. So now the last thing we're going to do is, we've got our jump start, we've got our jumping loop, we're going to add the last animation state here, which is going to be our jump land or jump end. We're going to make the transition from the jumping loop to the jump end, and finally the transition from the jump end to the blend tree. So this transition here we want it to only happen when we actually land on the ground. So I'm going to go ahead and add a condition to this, which is going to be jumping, but this time it's only going to happen if jumping is false, because that means we've landed. And we're going to go ahead and say that it doesn't have an exit time, because again, that we want this to happen immediately, just as soon as you land. And we're going to go ahead and set that transition duration to, what did we set it to over here? 0.05. I think that's fine. So we'll set this blend to a very small number. Again, you can tweak with these values if you want to see if you can get something that looks better. Then whenever we do our jump end, I'm going to go ahead and set the motion of our jump end to the jump end animation that we have here. I'm going to then go ahead and say that it will transition back to our running and idle. It will have an exit time, and the exit time should be probably like 1, and the duration time could be 0. However, we might want to blend this a little bit from the jump end into running again, so I'm going to extend this manually a little bit here, and now I can see my jump end is blending slightly into the run, and you can kind of see this blending into the idle in the preview actually. So the last thing we're going to do in the code is set the jumping to false. So we need to do this whenever we land on the ground. Where is the code for whenever we land on the ground? It's actually in the ground check. Here's the code here. We can see when trigger enter and we're on the ground, then we're on the ground. So yes, blah, blah, blah. We're doing all this cool stuff like saying is grounded equals true. That's the code for when we land on the ground. Now I can't do animcontroller.setBull jumping here because this is in the ground check and the animator controller is a variable of the player controller. However, what we can do is use the reference we already have of the player controller. So I can do controller.animcontroller.setBull. So we're accessing the variable inside this player controller that we already have a reference to. This time, however, we want to set bull to false because we want to go ahead and stop jumping. So I'm going to build that. I always build and not save because sometimes if you save, it won't save all of your scripts, and sometimes it won't even save some of your scripts. It's very confusing. Mainly, I just do build, which is if you have this build window, you can go right down and build solution here, or just Control-Shift-B. So now let's see what happens whenever we run the code for our jumping. I jump in the air, and then I land when I land on the ground. Now, our character is sort of skating through the air. We're having the same problem with the landing animation that we had with the jumping animation, which is it's simply not happening fast enough. So let's go ahead and go back to my jump and see what did we do with the land jumping animation that we can do with the start animation. Well, for one, the character spends a lot of time in the air before they land. So I'm going to have the animation start roughly here instead, move it along so that the animation starts just before I land, like this. Poof. And then we're going to go ahead and cut out all of this other extra stuff as well that happens after my character's feet are on the ground. So actually the animation that we're going to use is, look at this character dance. The animation we're using is just the moment before we have both of our feet on the ground and the moments after we begin our landing. So now we've got this really short animation. The other thing I can do if I want to is increase the speed again. I could set this to 1.5 as well. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like now. There's still this weird delay, I think, but I think that looks a lot better. In fact, that might be good enough for now. We can tweak these values a lot, right, to get something that looks really fluid. We could have a looping animation whenever our character jumps. In fact, hilariously at the moment, I would almost say that our character looks like they're dabbing every time they jump. Maybe that's just me. It almost looks like that. It's hilarious. But, depending on the animation we have, depending on what frame we freeze for jumping. Now, if we really wanted this to look nice, we would probably have, instead of the freeze frame, we would probably have this bespoke animation that will loop for our character falling, where they'll sort of like flail their arms very slightly as they fall over. But I think for now, this looks grand. We'd have to have a bespoke animation specifically for looping while we're in the air. Otherwise, it will not look great if we loop something that isn't supposed to be looped, which is what I'm doing, pulling this from one single animation. to start with. So it's quite a complex system that we have here, but really what we've got is a number of different states, and we're transitioning to those states based on a condition that we can then set in code. So like if we had another animation, like for example, if we wanted a different animation to play whenever we double jump in the air, then we would want to do pretty similar stuff. We'd have an animation that we'd import. We'd set that animation to a state, and we would, whenever we double jump, we would say, okay, now change to that new animation state in the code. So hopefully you've learned a lot now about animation. It is quite complex, but once you get your head around it, it's pretty cool. Like even now, I think this character controller looks a lot better with these simple animations than it did as a block that was just moving around. So now that you've got your character, I would start really messing around in Unity, right, with rigid body objects that we can push around and jump on, as well as other platforming challenges, and see what you can come up with.